Hi everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call The Deranged Revisited. So right here is a piece I originally did in 2005, and like most art you do, your most recent piece of art is always like the one that you're most proud of and you feel is the most accomplished, and at the time I felt that this was the best painting that I had ever done. Obviously looking back on it, I think I've come a long way, but I still get the same feeling actually when I look at it, that like, wow, that was really good. I hit everything that I wanted to hit, and I tried some techniques, and obviously, not all of the design is great, and definitely not all of the painting and all that kind of stuff is great, but I definitely still remember sort of how I felt when it was completed. And I see people do these sort of challenges all the time where they're taking an old piece and they're redrawing it now, and I thought, hey, this could be something really fun to do, so let's give it a shot. Now, unfortunately, I did start this piece before I turned the video recording quality up, so this isn't going to be as high res as some of my last stuff, because I actually did this sketch a bit ago. Like basically what you just saw before it went lower opacity, I did that a bit ago, and then kind of put the whole thing away weirdly, and then just decided, let's come back and actually do something with that. So I forgot to transfer that rough sketch into a new canvas, because that's just the way Procreate works regarding its time-lapse recording quality. So unfortunately, the actual video is lower res than I would like, but the final art is still the same, so we'll go ahead and do the video anyways, because this was also sort of a interesting exercise, because I mean, we all understand the interesting exercise of redrawing something that you drew prior, but I'm going to kind of come at this a little bit from also a character design perspective. Oh, it's certainly hard to completely divorce my mentality from the fact that this is a recreation of one of my own pieces of art, but what I hope to accomplish during this was to treat it as though it was a character design that was done by someone else for something else, and then I came in and was doing like an update to it. So as you can see, I'm making some choices across this design as I'm doing the rough sketch, as to what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to get rid of, and because I'm thinking of it in the context of I have a base piece of art that I'm working off of and I'm going to be updating it, I'm also thinking about color even while I'm doing the sketch portion. So you can see the biggest change that I already made, aside from his general shapes, because those are getting kind of updated as well. You can see the part of his like shirt that comes down and is really long and it has that pattern along the bottom. I greatly simplified that pattern. This pattern seems to sort of tell a story, but there's actually no story there, and otherwise it's just kind of complicated and weird, and you can tell stories through patterns and details like that in a character, but I don't have one there, and so I thought, okay, let's get away from that. It also had like almost like a gothic vibe, but the rest of the character isn't. The rest of the character is kind of like witch doctory, so I wanted to pull away from that and simplify that pattern. Other elements though that I have that I'm absolutely keeping are things like the exploding rat and the like sort of chicken foot looking thing, and then he's still going to have the acorn bracelet. Here I'm just cleaning up some of the anatomy and making sure that I'm making it work, because the character in the original is almost kind of jumping, but I wanted this character to be planted on the ground. The staff though, I do simplify, and I could have made it crazy. I definitely could have added the stuff that's on it, but again, I wanted to clean up the design a little bit and bring some of the focus back down to the character. And I wanted to try and make some aspects a little bit less complicated with the posing. As you can see in the original, he has his arms crossed over, which is fine as a pose goes, but I just felt that it was bringing a lot of mess in there, especially around the hands and the acorn bracelet and the fingers and all that kind of stuff. So when I was working on this, I was thinking that it'd be nice to get back to some lined artwork, and I totally spaced out and I just started drawing his face, which is what you're seeing here, me actually putting down like tight lines on the face. and then I realized that my whole intention was to paint this. And I could have gone for something where I was mimicking the look of the original, where there's lines and paint, which is also something that I want to do in a future piece again, because it's been a while since I've done something like that. But in this, I was just like, wow, what am I doing? And I totally snapped out of it and went back into painting. One thing that was nice, though, was those tighter lines, of course, gave me a better blueprint for when I'm actually adding the structure to the face, so it kind of worked out in that way. But yeah, that whole like going in and doing like really tight lines like that was actually just me spacing out. Now this part is when the flat process starts. I'm just going to let the video roll for a bit so that you guys can watch the flatting process. There's nothing much to explain there, but once a number of the flats have gotten put in, I'll start talking about the colors and my choices in the colors. So now that some of the colors are really getting in there and it's starting to get sort of to where it needs to be, let's take a second and look at the originals colors so that we can kind of compare here. Now this is back when I used to use a specific technique that I do every now and then use, but it just usually isn't what I'm in the mood for, which is there's a flat color for the entire figure, and that's used as the shadow layer. Sorry, not really the shadow layer, but the darkest value for everything. So there's like a dark gray that's kind of underneath every one of those colors. So when, like, say the sort of blue-gray of his skin ends, it goes into that gray. And when the sort of green of his shirt ends, it goes into that gray as well. And you can see there's actually some really weird choices that are kind of made in there. Like the green goes from like a really pale light green-blue to a green to a red, and then it goes into like that gray area. And that was something that I did to kind of like unify everything, but there's a lot of pitfalls with that. I do, again, think that works every now and then for certain looks that you're going for. But depending on that color that you choose, I mean, it really just impacts everything else. And in this case, using like a dark gray like that, it has a certain vibe to it. And I think that in this case, it makes it a little muddy. Now, that gives a kind of cool contrast between his sort of darker figure and then all this like light and magic around him. But I can tell you that that type of a thought process wasn't intentional. That was just the way that it ended up, because I was really kind of teaching myself Photoshop at this point. It's kind of weird to say, but a lot of my early stuff that you guys haven't seen, like what I was doing in college, I was like terrified of Photoshop, and I did all my coloring in Flash. If you go back to my DeviantArt page and you go all the way to the very beginning, you'll see that it's like all colored in Flash. And then eventually I just sort of bucked up and started working on doing more stuff in Photoshop. And I had to kind of develop all the techniques on my own, kind of like looking at art and saying like, how do I get that look? And then really playing with it. It wasn't until I was in studios as a concept artist, working with other concept artists, that I got a lot of information on Photoshop, because we were all working side by side and trying to solve the look and feel of a certain game, and then we were, sharing some techniques to try and achieve that, and then it's, from there, art is just taking its normal path where you're trying to figure out looks and you're trying to figure out techniques to achieve those looks. So now that we're back over into this other piece, or the current piece that we're talking about, we're going to be employing completely different techniques than what the other one was. I should also, of course, point out that the other one was done in Photoshop, and this obviously isn't. It's done in Procreate. So that means that I'm using my more modern techniques, modern for me. This is going to be a series of flats with multiply layers on top for the shadow, and then a variety of other layers in order to do additional tweaks and adjustments. So if you've been watching all of the recent stuff, you are up to speed on exactly what my techniques are going to be here. So now I'm going through and I'm making adjustments. You might have seen it flash by. I made a quick adjustment on like his acorn bracelet, and now we're doing some of the local stuff on his face before the shadows come in. So we're putting some of the red, the blood coming through his nose and his ears, and the darkening around the eyes and all that kind of stuff, and adding the you can see at the bottom there, the back part of his like jaggedy skirt thing. I added that at the bottom, and now we're moving into shadows. Because everything is going to be coming from this like green-blue light source, I made the shadows red. They're like a light tan red, like a lot of what I've been doing lately. Which, of course, we're going to be mixing it up soon, but, it's been working really well, and it's been really inspiring, so I'm continuing to work on that. And for this piece, with its particular lighting, it just made a lot of sense. Now, what are some things that I haven't included yet in the piece before I've moved into the shadows? Well, I didn't do any of the detailing on that bracelet around his wrist. The original one has these weird jewels in it, which was probably me trying to communicate that he got these things from various sources and that they're not all like supposed to feel like they're from him. He probably got it from, killing a guy, or it was given to him, or I don't know, whatever. But I felt like it was just a little too bizarre it stands out a little bit too much. In fact, to the point to where it's absolutely possible that this guy could exist in a world with that kind of jewelry, but he's already communicating a type of world that he's from, and it doesn't feel like that would be very accessible. So unless we were actually telling a story with this guy and establishing that, it would just feel a little bizarre. So I pull that back and I make it look like something that's going to fit him a little bit more. I also didn't include the flames around the weird chicken, not chicken foot, and I didn't include the sort of burst of light coming out of his of that rat, which, by the way, those are essentially like reagents so that he can cast whatever spell he's about to unleash, kind of thing. And that's basically it. Oh, and I didn't do the skulls yet that are sort of coming off the back, the sort of reinterpreted skulls. And that's just because I wanted to move into the shadows and start testing the lighting, and I could always go back in. I knew with this like big massive light source, so actually I should talk for a second about the light source and the lighting in general in this. The lighting in this is largely like just kind of faked bullshit. Because I knew that I had a lot of elements that I wanted to balance, and I wasn't going to get like crazy specific about it. So the green light coming from the bottom is essentially just an uplight that's lighting him in green, and then I was going to treat the rat explosion, I guess you could call it, the rat explosion, and the chicken foot glow as like their own sort of like little localized, almost like their own little environments, their own little lighting environments, to kind of interrupt it so that we could bring some more colors in there. And then the skulls coming off of his back, I wanted to be a new color as well, which we'll get there. We'll get to explaining that, just to have some more interesting colors so that by the time this thing is done, it's like, I don't think there's like a color left out, but hopefully I'm managing all of that nicely. That's the plan, at least. So what we're doing right now is we're doing some of our like form shadows, trying to define the figure before we start putting in the heavier shadows that are going to dictate that directional light. So again, as I've explained before, I call it form shadow instead of like an ambient occlusion pass because I'm not being very disciplined in making sure that it's AO. There's like aspects to this that's AO, but there are a lot of times where I just opt to use that shadow to bring some definition, which may or may not be accurate to real life. And then when I bring in the other shadow, which I sometimes just call the direct light shadow, I call it that because that's my opportunity to establish the main lighting. And so these are just techniques and terms that I've developed in order to sort of explain it better on this channel and to sort of explain it to myself, I guess you could say. And it's just a methodology that's been working, so I'm continuing to hammer away at refining that overall. Also, if you're watching this and wondering how I'm painting in certain sections and it's all bleeding over and other times it's not bleeding over, Stan Lee always used to say that every comic book is someone's first comic book. So if you're new to this channel, actually if you're old to this channel, sorry, I'm going to explain it again. If you're new to this channel, I hope this explains it for you. What I'm doing is a method called Select Paint, Select Clear that I essentially made up. It's again another nonsense term, but if you go down to the bottom of the description, there's a video that explains it a little bit more thoroughly, and the simple explanation is I am selecting the bottommost layer of the flats, and then on a new topmost shadow layer, I'm painting in the shadow. Then I'm selecting the next layer and clearing it, and then selecting it again and painting again. And what happens then is you're selecting a flat and you're painting in all that area. And then any part that bleeds over because that flat is underneath, the next layer up will clear it. And then you select it and paint there, and then the next layer up will clear that. And it sounds like it's a little rigid and technical, but really, to me, it gives me actually more artistic freedom because it allows me to be a little bit wilder and messier. Now, I want to get back to the color choices here because you can see me adjusting some things in the colors. What we're doing is I'm trying to get him as a character to have his blocking read a little more clearly. Like I said, the original one was like a little bit muddier. So here I'm trying to push the greens in him a little bit more yellow and less blue, trying to get his clothes separate from his body. And I know that all of this stuff is going to get impacted by the blue-green light, so I want to try and make it look like it's all there. I'm indicating the uplight, so now we're going to switch to the different shadow. I know that that's going to impact everything and make it more green, and I need to make sure that actually blue-green to be specific, and so I need to make sure that all of these shapes are going, or all these colors are going to read differently. The colors within the shapes, so that his shapes read clearly through color. And so we're going to get to the shadow pass, which is right now. You can see me painting those cast shadows where like his collar is casting onto his hair. After we do these two shadow passes, we're going to move into adding that green light. It's important for me in my process to do these shadows first, because we can actually use these shadows to clear away from the light, so that we can establish like where the light is completely being blocked by another object, like his arm or something like that. And now the shadows that are being cast are being approximated. I didn't get overly technical with this. I didn't set up like a maquette or anything to really check the lighting on this. It's all just approximated. I think that if you are really going for hyper accuracy, you should probably put in that type of work for sure. For me personally though, this is just something I'm trying to have fun with, and it's an illustration that I have a lot of mentality around just kind of getting the thing done and like moving through, and the way to do that is to not get too bogged down with some of those details. That's not me saying like don't go for perfection, or don't go for, actually it is me saying don't go for perfection, but what I'm saying is it's not me saying don't go for quality and half-ass things. It's more about like there's a certain amount of work that's absolutely all you need, and so you should put that amount of work in if it's capturing the look that you're going for. And if something is going to take you twice as long, but you're like, oh, but this is going to be absolutely accurate, and the end result is more or less the same, I would argue towards the getting shit done method as opposed to the hyper calculated method, I guess you could say. I would say that there's probably something in that message where you would say to yourself like, oh, so he's saying like I could just wing it. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that like when you get into the realities of creating art for a living, there's time and money and all of those things. And if you can communicate the same thing with a more economic use of your time, just do that. So now what we've got here, to sort of recap, is we've got one shadow layer that's doing like a form shadow. It's a pseudo ambient occlusion pass. Then we've got another shadow layer on top of that is like the same color, and it's also set to multiply. And then so these two layers are playing with each other, and they are establishing the combination of the form of the shapes as well as the direct lighting from the spell being cast down below. Something that I really intended to do with this piece, and you'll see it coming in towards the end, is I start breaking away from the turpentine brush a little bit and bringing in more soft lighting with an airbrush in order to really capture the magic quality of the actual magic that he's using. Because as much as I play with the turpentine brush, I could definitely like struggle with it forever and probably get somewhere where it would be good, but that would just be kind of like a, hey, look, I did it kind of excuse. I don't know that it would actually get me a look that's particularly unique. So for the look of this, I go with a big soft brush to get the glows off the magic right and to make all of that feel good. So now we're going to continue with the shadow process. There's not much to say, so I'm going to let it just roll. Just know that what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about the forms of the character, the direction of the light, where those shadows would be strongest and where shadows would be cast, and I'm just kind of going through that process layer by layer to make sure that I'm solving that. And I'll come back in when I notice something that is particularly unique about the process. kind of a funny moment where I realized that I had absentmindedly painted the shadow in on his nose backwards, because it was just habit, because usually that's what you're painting. And I go in and I actually erase it from the previous shadow pass, re-put it in, and now I go in and I'm putting the direct shadow in to try and reinforce that. I just thought it was kind of funny that I totally borked that. And now we're done with the shadow passes, or at least the first time we do it. We do revisit it a little bit and kind of tweak it, but now we're going into adding the lighting. So I started this process by selecting the green from the spell that's being cast, and I started going through the select paint, select clear method, applying the light. Now I'm applying the light in a way where I'm just kind of keeping in mind this gradient of going from bottom to top, but I didn't want to entirely I could have basically just done a gradient across his body, and that could have worked. and then I would have just selected the shadows and deleted away and then been good to go. But I wanted to make sure some of the brush stroke stuff is in there, and I wanted to make sure that there were some times where I was choosing for that light to fall off a little bit, and so that's why I decided to not just do like a gradient. There you can see me playing with a bunch of layer effects, just trying to see like what's the actual look I want to go for, and then I turned it all back to 100% opacity, normal layer, just to see where the paint is that I'm laying in. And now I'm just moving through every layer, applying this in the way that I think that it makes the most sense. And something that's kind of interesting about this is, depending on the method of painting that I decide to go with, I'm either painting like some shadow layers on top of everything, or I'm painting where I'm actually color picking and then doing multiple layers to sort of build that up. And this is kind of like a switch in mentality. You go from doing the shadow layers, and now it's like, okay, now I'm thinking back to more of like a applying light type methodology. And so it's just sort of a funny thing where it switches actually to more of a comfort zone for me. So now we're just going in and we're applying all of this light, and then when this pass is done, we're going to select the shadows only from the direct light layer, and then we're going to delete away. Here we're just adding the light to the face. The face is pretty high on the layer stack, so this is starting to get to where we're gonna wrap up the lighting phase. I shouldn't say wrap up the lighting phase. We actually revisit this and we do a few more tweaks and stuff, especially once the magic comes in. But it's sort of like these are sort of the three pillars of the look and feel of it. So those strings actually at the very end are the absolute last part of, they're the highest layers, weirdly enough, those little strings. So now we've cleared everything away on the shadow layer, and we are starting to play with the settings for the lighting, as well as the, you could see for a second there I had like a color layer over the whole thing. I actually ended up removing that because there was definitely enough intensity from the green, and I felt like the color layer was washing things out instead of adding richness to the whole image. So now we're painting in the little blast from the popping rat in the image, which is mostly hand painted, just color picked, but then there's a little bit of a add layer on top of it all to give it a little bit of a punch, and adding these little sparks, which are then duplicated and blurred with, and then switch to an add layer, and that's what gives that sort of intense glow on the entire thing. And next we'll move into the weird three-toed chicken foot. In the original, this has a very graphic flame shape around it, which I've just kind of never liked about it, so I decided to bring some purple in here, and then I continue that echoing of the purple in the purple from the skulls that will be behind the character eventually. Here's some bounce light, which I actually come back later and readdress and kind of make it a little bit better. Okay, so now we're just cleaning up that energy that's going around him, that sort of green plasma that's swirling about him. And then now we're adding in reflective touches, and not all reflective touches throughout the entire thing, but just sort of going through and finding opportunities to do that. And then here is some darkening to add just a little bit more intensity of the light coming from the bottom up. It's already very bright with all of that green, so adding more brightness at the bottom really isn't a good idea, but adding darkness at the top will, of course, increase the contrast from the light to the dark. And it'll give us the same intensity without having to blow everything out too much. You see here that I'm doing this with the turpentine brush, and this is about the point where I make the decision to go with more gradients and more softness, so eventually I'll come back in and I'll add more of a gradient soft darkening there, but then I'll keep some of that turpentine brush just to make sure that the texture is there. I'll address that when we get to it. Here I'm just messing with like a lot of little tweaky stuff. You could see if you go back, there's like
the intensity of the blush on his nose and fingers gets increased and things like that. Just trying to make sure that now that all these color layers and shadow layers are being turned on, that we are making sure everything is still reading as strong as we want and as true as we want. So now for the purple skulls in the back. In the original, you have these sort of green, very graphic skulls, and I wanted to keep that same symbolism, I guess you could say, in there, but I wanted to bring in the purple from the chicken foot thing and then make this less graphic and a little bit more like it's an actual an actual physical shape in the world around the character. And so that's why we are switching to this type of a look, which is in the original sketch as well. And I just sort of knew that when I got to this point I was going to want to revisit it. So in the sketch I definitely revisit it, and then when we get to the color it's like, okay, let's make this purple, because again the original image has a lot of sort of green, blue, and by bringing in these other colors it just makes it more interesting. It has a lot more color on the page. And I kind of like this idea better. I mean, I was obviously playing with some graphic treatments in the original. That's why we had like the graphic sort of like burst from the rat, the graphic fire, then this graphic thing, and then this sort of plasma is also kind of graphic that's going around him. But here I kind of like that it's more of like this smoky stuff that's pulling apart, and it's in the shape of skulls and stuff. One thing though is once I get this in, I start trying to figure out how to make it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more energy based. So we start of course by doing a bit of a brightening towards the character, as if the character is giving off the energy, and the bright part usually implies intensity, so the idea is that there's a fall off here, and then I try to solve how I'm going to do the rest of it. So I merge all of that into a layer, and then I start playing with gradients to sort of knock aspects of it back and lowering opacity, and then I do this soft airbrush fill on his form so that the glow is sort of reading onto his body a little bit, and that more or less is working for me, but we'll come back and tweak it further. Here I've decided to turn off all of the layers that are affecting things, just to further tweak colors and try to get some aspects of it actually back closer to the original, which is what I'm doing. And part of that is to separate him better from his clothing, as well as to just work in a little bit more of the original vibe, because as time went on it was moving a little too far away from it. Now we're adding that little outlining around the skulls in the back, and then moving into some more softening of some of these like gradients and effects. So that purple got softened coming off of the chicken foot, this purple got intensified a little bit on his body from the skulls, and then the darkening from the top to the bottom on his overall figure also got smoothed out a little bit. And now we're moving into the background, which is supposed to just keep it dark like the original, but I didn't want to go with quite the exact same background. So instead we're just doing the background as though it was vaguely lit by the magic as well. So there's sort of an upward lighting happening. And then so I did that all with gradients, and then I went in with a white turpentine brush and just put that texture all back in there, set it to overlay, and then lowered the opacity on it quite a bit, just to give the texture but keep the gradient. And then we're adding in smoke just to add some extra ambiance and some extra effects to really sell that he's in the environment and that he's having some effect on the environment. It's not doing like a full background by any means, and I actually considered doing that, like it through silhouettes and stuff, similar to what I do with the A Village Corrupted stuff, but I felt like this was already a pretty busy image and I didn't want to go crazy with it. It is ultimately about him, not about the environment that he's in. Now just doing the sort of last minute changes, moved the signature around, looking at certain things, and then right here you see I'm adding that white in the bottom right. I was about to post this and then I realized that like I kind of never finished that section of it, so I wanted to go in and do something, but I didn't really finish it exactly how I wanted. So you can see here that I'm kind of messing with it, and then I'll pull it back and I'll adjust it a little bit, and then we eventually will end up with how it was when I decided to finally post it. It's way simpler than what I was toying with a second ago, but it does add a little bit of a finish quality to that section, so it was a good idea to go back and revisit it a bit. We also added at some point in there the detail on that bracelet. You can see the sort of eyes going around it. And that is essentially it for this piece. This right here is the final, and so let's transition to the original so that you guys can see that. So that was the original design. A lot of aspects in the original design were carried over. Some things were improved. I think a lot of the shape language was improved and some of the colors were improved. Let's go ahead and shift back to the new version again. And so I think we really came out with something that is an improvement, but captures the essence of the original. Here's a bit of a tighter close-up shot just so that you can see some of the forms and the details a little bit more. Close-up of his face. And that's it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this sort of blast from the past, this reimagining of a past piece. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you guys on the next video. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.